The intention was clear, the justification debatable, the outcome disastrous. Vladimir Putin wanted to keep NATO far from Ukraine, but what it seems to have done is united the West against Russia like never before. I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is Putin's NATO gambit. It is hard to know what Vladimir Putin is thinking, but by many accounts, he's fighting to restore Russia to its former glory. His calls to arms was to stop NATO's hostile advance dead in its tracks, to bring fellow Slavs in Ukraine back into the cultural fold of the Russian people, and to make Kiev an example for capitals of other former Soviet republics.
Dear comrades, on February 24th, a special military operation in Ukraine started. While carrying out their tasks to protect our people in Donbass and ensure the security of our homeland, Russian soldiers and officers are acting bravely, like true heroes. Our troops fight with persistence and full understanding that their cause is right. Dear comrades, I want to say that the special military operation is proceeding strictly in line with the timetable. According to plan, all the tasks that have been set are being successfully resolved.
For Putin, it may all be going according to plan, but on the ground, it is hard to see it that way. Over a week into the assault on Ukraine, Russia is far from being in control, despite having military superiority. The Russian Air Force has failed to achieve air dominance, a crucial step in any modern military invasion. Serious questions are being asked about Russia's military strategy. Convoys have been picked apart by Ukrainian forces. Russian tanks have been stranded and abandoned after running out of fuel. And the reportedly low morale of Russian soldiers seems quite unlike that of a military superpower. If Russian generals hoped to roll into Kiev and establish a Kremlin-friendly regime, they may not have anticipated the level of resistance they have faced. Ukrainian civilians have put up roadblocks to slow the onslaught of Russian forces. In some places, they have risked their lives to block tanks. Thousands have taken up arms to defend their country. Putin's NATO gambit has also resulted in a revival of the European Union as a global player. The regional bloc had been struggling with internal disputes over funding, identity, and cohesion. But the Russian threat has jolted the EU into unified conviction and action. And now, an increasing number of countries, in addition to Ukraine, are desperately wanting to join, like Moldova, Kosovo, and Georgia.
It's a historic day for Georgia. We're signing an application for EU membership on behalf of the country. Application for EU membership is yet another milestone on the path of European integration of Georgia. It's a stage which turns a new page in our history and continues the effort of our ancestors, which is aimed at the accession of Georgia into a common European family.
It is a similar story with NATO. A little more than a year ago, the transatlantic military alliance was struggling to find relevance. Former U.S. President Donald Trump slashed NATO funding, sinking ties between the U.S. and European allies like Germany to new lows. But today, NATO has found renewed purpose and direction, becoming more appealing to countries like Sweden and Finland.
NATO allies have implemented unprecedented sanctions. We provide support to Ukraine. At the same time, NATO is not part of the conflict. NATO is a defensive alliance. We don't seek war, conflict with Russia. At the same time, we need to make sure that there is no misunderstanding about our commitment to defend and protect all allies, and therefore we have increased the presence of NATO forces in the eastern part of the alliance. This is a defensive presence.
And let's bring in our panel for today. From Moscow is Sergey Utkin. He is the head of the Strategic Assessment Section at the Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations. He advises the Russian government on EU-Russian relations. Tengiz Khaladze joins us from Tbilisi. He is the former advisor to the president of Georgia and the author of several books about Russian foreign policy. And in Istanbul is Ambassador Matthew Bryza, a former U.S. diplomat who mediated the conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia and was a co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group. He is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. Sergey, let me begin with you. Let me try my luck by getting a response from you on a question which I believe many across the world are trying to find an answer to. Since you are an advisor to the Russian government, tell me, what is on Putin's mind?
It's very hard to say that exactly, even for those people who work in a very narrow circle around Putin. It looks like he is communicating a lot of ideas that are on his mind, and these ideas, they refer to this concept of Russians and Ukrainians being the one people that got separated by malign forces, and now he's on the sacred path to bring them back together, which is, if you ask me, not at all what I would advise to the government.
So the idea, as I understand from what you have just told me, the idea of President Putin is to unite the Ukrainians and the Russians. But is that where Putin ends, or do you think he's going to go beyond that?
Well, it's when you hear that he's speaking about demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification, how can you realistically aim at goals like this if you don't control at least large parts of Ukraine? And Putin was speaking for all those years about the Russian-speaking people of the southeast of Ukraine. And now much of this military campaign is developing in those southern and eastern regions. So you may probably indeed expect, even if it sounds like something from fiction books, that there will be an attempt to impose a sustainable control on a significant part of Ukrainian territory and draw it towards Russia. Putin says that his goal is not the occupation of Ukraine, but we had a lot of claims like this is not going to happen, this is not going to happen, but now all the red lines are crossed, and it's very hard to believe that there are still red lines that matter.
Okay, Sergey, now before I go to my other guest, very quickly, do you feel your comments today on this show might not be well received among the people you advise in Russia?
Well, I understand that the official position is different, but my feeling about the academia and analysis was always that it's not your task to just present things that the government likes. It's your task to analyze and to deliver the conclusions that you consider important. And my conclusion is that there is no good way out for Russia in this situation, that this is a catastrophe, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia as well.
Okay, Matthew, let me come to you. Now, if President Putin's idea was to counter NATO's presence in the region with this so-called military operation in Ukraine, certainly that is not working, isn't it? Because if anything, this military operation has prompted NATO to become more prominent in the region.
I thoroughly agree, Jafar. I mean, you have Finland and Sweden now talking about wanting to join NATO. And for years, they were neutral. I mean, I ran a think tank in Tallinn, Estonia, and we were always trying to stimulate debate about NATO membership. And the Finns, they would just avoid the question all the time. Now their own president is saying, well, this is a real question for us now. And as far as NATO and transatlantic unity is concerned, I mean, it's been decades since NATO has been so like-minded and so unified. And it's never been the case that NATO or the transatlantic family together, US and the EU member states and Canada, have been willing to impose such really tough sanctions on Russia, which are designed, let's face it, to cripple and destroy the Russian economy. So there's this massive solidarity of NATO right now and a growing physical presence. We're seeing more and more NATO troops moving now in defensive posture into the Baltic states and Poland. The NATO response force has now been deployed for the first time ever. And we've seen Germany do a historic 180-degree turnaround last Saturday when Chancellor Olaf Scholz not only said that, of course, Germany would not proceed with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but that it would actually send weapons to Ukraine to defend it. It's a complete reversal of German foreign policy, whereby Germany was always the weakest link in NATO in being firm with Russia, and now it's completely aligned with the United States.
Certainly, Matthew, it seems the West is more united than ever before when it comes to Russia. In fact, we are seeing an unprecedented unity among NATO member states. Tengiz, do you think NATO was united when your country, Georgia, was invaded in 2008 and also when Crimea was annexed by the Russians in 2014?
Thank you so much for this question and for the opportunity to take part in this important show. And first of all, my greetings to my close friend Matthew Bryza, and my solidarity once again to the Ukrainian people. And before I answer your question, so one short remark. There is no South Ossetia. It was aggression against Georgia, against the sovereign nation. Russian aggression, and my friend Matthew and other friends, they try to prevent and stop Russian aggression. Regrettably, and I back to your question, regrettably, those sanctions, what we see right now, they are late at least for 15 years. They should be imposed in 2007, when first time Putin delivered his speech in Munich, and when he very clearly highlighted the new Cold War is already started. So what we are witnessing in Georgia, it was really dividing NATO, really dividing West, contradiction among the partners, and no unity and no understanding the reality and how the threat is serious. But that's why we had annexation of Crimea in 2014, but in 2014, Russia, as well as in 2008, did not pay the proper price for its inappropriated actions against sovereign countries. And that's why today we have war in Ukraine, which is not war just against the Ukraine. This is war against the civilization. Under rocket strike are kindergartens, hospitals, civilians, and not just Lugansk and a military infrastructure. Kiev and peaceful civilians. Yesterday, under rocket strikes, was nuclear power in Ukraine. So this is the serious threat for all of us.
Tengiz, let me add one more question here. As I understand, you were saying that NATO and much of the West's inaction in 2008 and 2014 led to Russian aggression. Let me ask you, do you think that inaction prompted, perhaps encouraged President Putin to do what he's doing right now?
Definitely, I agree, because this policy that not to irritate Russia really that encouraged Putin to be more aggressive. And today, maybe what Mr. Putin did not expect it was unity of the West. And just imagine that not only Sweden and Finland, but even Switzerland, neutral country, now joined to the sanction. So this is the miscalculation of Mr. Putin today.
We're going to discuss that in detail, what the willingness of these countries to join NATO means for the wider region. Sergey, but let me come to you. Now, Whether or not NATO's inaction encouraged President Putin to do what he's doing right now in Ukraine is, of course, debatable. But let me ask you, Sergey, what is that one thing that President Putin expected to happen, but it did not happen in Ukraine?
He probably expected that the people in Ukraine would rather be supportive of his effort to get them freedom, as he puts that, freedom from this corrupt oligarchic government. So he positions this Russian military presence as liberating, but you see no signs of that. You see people who actually treat those military as foreign troops on their ground, and they want these foreign troops to leave. Whether you will be able to change this attitude, or at least make it look like this attitude changed even in those several regions where you have a majority of Russian-speaking population, is still an open question. And this is what makes this war last, because many people believe that the idea was that in the first few days there would be a change in favor of Russia in those areas where you have this military presence, and now it looks like it will take weeks to achieve about anything. Mr. Putin says that this all goes according to plan, in accordance to the schedule that they elaborated, but how can you check this claim?
Sergey, and President Putin right now is also losing support among the Russian elites. Do you think he expected that to happen?
Well, the consequences of this military operation are, of course, a shock for many, and you have people already feeling the changing economic situation, the drop in rate of ruble, the foreign companies that leave Russia, the restricted freedom of movement in terms of closed airspace. And I think many are unhappy, but whether there is some critical mass that could sort of send a signal to the president that he has to make some adjustments, I doubt that in a very verticalized system like he built, where he takes decisions and others have to implement them.
Okay. Matthew, let me come to you. Now, in one of my earlier shows, I remember I had asked you whether or not NATO poses a threat to Russia. Your response was a big no, it does not. Let me ask you the same question, but let me change the order. Does Russia pose a threat to NATO?
Oh, of course it does. I mean, you know, it's the concern now is whether or not instability in Ukraine it not only is going to in some way spill over, you know, across this border. We've got this massive flow of refugees into the NATO heartland, not only into Poland, but onward into Germany now. But also the question you raised earlier with Sergey: do President Putin's ambitions now extend beyond Ukraine? He has said that the reason he's doing this, in addition to what Sergey said, is to fulfill his demands with regard to pushing back NATO to its pre-1997 borders. And it's an openly known fact that Russia defines its primary enemy, not adversary, but enemy, as the United States, and then by extension NATO, in Russia's official military doctrine. So Russia says it's a threat to NATO, and in this case, I believe it.
Okay, now Tengiz, just picking up on what Matthew says, it seems Russia does pose a threat to NATO. So just trying to understand things from Moscow's perspective, don't you think if Moscow perceives NATO as a threat, it is understandable in some ways? What are your thoughts, Tengiz?
I fully agree with Matthew, and frankly speaking, when we are talking that NATO expansion is kind of threat for Russia, it has nothing rational behind, because look at the NATO enlargement history and relationship with Russia. Before 2014, before the first serious sanction, Russia has the most successful cooperation with the NATO member countries, including military cooperation. So there was no threat, and never NATO was threatened Russia. It was Russia who occupied NATO's partner countries. It was Russia who violated internationally recognized border. It was Russia who experienced hybrid warfare in the various countries, including NATO member countries. It was Russia who poisoning people in the NATO member countries, I mean, Great Britain. And so it was Russia who engaged in elections and so on. So NATO never was threat
But
to
Tengiz,
Russia.
don't you think the perception of threat works two ways?
No. That was the only threat, maybe, if we are talking about the threat. The NATO's enlargement is the problem for Putin, because NATO's enlargement prevent him to meddling in the internal politics of the independent countries. So that's all. For Russia, NATO is no threat, not at all. And once again, before 2014, Russia has brilliant relationship with NATO member countries.
Okay, let me put that to Sergey. Sergey, now in one of your earlier responses, you said that President Putin, in your view, is conducting this military operation in Ukraine to unite the Ukrainians with the Russians. So where does the NATO enlargement part come into play? Is that a concern, a real concern for President Putin in your view?
Yes, I think it is a concern, not in the sense that he expects any kind of direct attack from NATO in any foreseeable future, but in the sense of power balance. NATO is seen as a form of U.S. presence in Europe, and this is felt like something undesirable in the Russian leadership circles, not just by Putin himself. Now, Russia indeed cooperated with NATO, but it also remained very critical from the Yeltsin years, from the 1990s, on NATO enlargement. And yes, you do have a number of windows of opportunity that were missed in terms of building a good, balanced relationship between NATO and Russia. But frankly, it is all now a kind of sideshow, given what we are witnessing in Ukraine. Whatever troubles can be there between NATO and Russia, and whatever you could do to make adjustments to the European security architecture, this doesn't justify what we are now witnessing in Ukraine.
Okay. Matthew, it's very interesting. Now, President Putin has long complained about NATO's presence in the region, but now, as you said in one of your earlier responses, there are more countries which have showed their willingness to join NATO. For example, Finland. Tell me, if countries like Finland do become a part of NATO, what does that mean for the future of regional security?
Well, from Russia's perspective, of course, it's a real geostrategic setback, as we were just hearing from Sergey. Finland, by the way, is a very capable military power. It has the largest deployment of artillery of any military in Europe. But it's quiet. Finland is quiet. It shares a long border with Russia. Finns themselves don't use a lot of words. But to have that portion of NATO, now its border, guarded by the Finnish military, that is a big advance forward for NATO in its ability to protect itself and to deter an attack by Russia. But geopolitically, going back to that, it will create a sense of loss in those great Russians, meaning people who think about the great Russian Empire, because Russia actually occupies half of Finland in Karelia. And so the part of Finland that remained independent is what we know now as the European Union member states. So there's a whole emotional undercurrent that would come along with Finland joining NATO that would make it, for someone like President Putin, all the more geopolitically painful. And one more point about why, going back to what Tengiz was saying, why the NATO and Ukraine's aspirations for NATO or Finland's, why this is seen as a loss for President Putin and Russia.
Right.
It's also because a successful democratic Ukraine or a successful democratic Georgia that chooses to join NATO is providing an alternative, a successful alternative to Putin's Russia. And that's a big threat to him as he worries about revolution in the streets.
Okay, gentlemen, we are in the dying minutes of the program. Sergey, let me come to you very quickly. Now, it was interesting to see President Putin say that Russia's military operation in Ukraine is going as per plan, even though the ground realities tell us otherwise. Was it a message by President Putin to NATO that Russia still has a master plan which it has not used yet?
Well, I think the main message was that of determination, that he is 100% sure of what he's doing, that he believes that truth is on his side, and that he will implement the goals of this operation, whatever the reaction is, whatever the sanctions. That was the key message. In terms of the instruments that he has in his disposal, we all know that, but I think when people start speculating about the use of nuclear weapons, this is like a step too far in comparison to what we can indeed expect. It's one thing to remind that Russia has these kind of capabilities, right, and the other to use it. I don't expect this.
All right, Sergey Utkin, Tengiz, Khaladze, and Matthew Bryza, thank you very much for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.